Hey everybody, David Boris here. Before we begin, I wanted to take a minute to ask you to check us out on Patreon. It's a great way to support this podcast because if you become a patron at patreon.com, you get early ad-free releases and exclusive behind-the-scenes bonus content you won't hear anywhere else. Patreon is a safe and secure way to support the podcast on a monthly basis. It helps me keep the show growing, and it helps me keep the show going. So become a patron today at patreon.com/hostilehistory. Okay, let's get to the show.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Okay, Mom, for my dorm, I'm thinking coquette meets poet core.
That sounds like a vibe. What do you need? And where do we get it?
Target. I already have everything on my mood board. A comforter, pillows, and a super cute floral lamp.
So you probably need a rug to tie it all together.
OMG, they have the perfect CMPC rug.
CMPC?
Coquette meets poet core.
Oh, okay. In that case, let's RTT.
Yeah, let's run to Target. You're getting it. Find your dorm inspiration and everything you need at Target.
The market pressed in on him like a living thing. Heat rose from the stone beneath his boots, carrying the scent of spices, sweat, roasting lamb, and the brine of the nearby sea. Voices collided overhead, Greek, Arabic, Latin, and others he could not place, blending into a constant, restless hum. He was a soldier, so he moved slowly, with one hand hovering near the hilt of his sword, though it remained sheathed. He had no armor. Instead, he wore a dust-stained cloak marked by battles that clung to him like a second skin. He paused at a stall where figs and almonds were stacked in careful pyramids. He picked up a fig, turning it in his fingers, its softness unfamiliar. The merchant smiled at him, tilting his head slightly in an almost apologetic manner. To the soldier, he looked very similar to the men he had faced in battle, but here, instead of swords clashing, a few coins changed hands. This exchange was simple and peaceful, and all around him, life surged. A little boy darted through the crowd laughing. A woman argued over dyed cloth, and somewhere above it all, a distant call to prayer drifted through the air, steady, unbroken. The soldier bit into the fig. Sweetness spread across his tongue, disarming in its gentleness. He scanned the crowd, not for enemies, but for meaning. He had once faced these people in battle, and he may face them again, but now they were absorbed in the quiet rituals of trade and survival. And he was part of that too.
Well, it's easy to get bound up in the idea of the Crusades being a 200-year period of, total war, as it were. But the truth is that for much of that period, the Crusaders and their descendants, the Franks, let's use that term, the Franks and the Muslims were interacting in other ways. They're making treaties with each other. They're trading with each other. Trade was huge. They are sharing ideas. They are attending each other's religious festivals. And in some cases, they were just hanging out.
I'm David Boris. I'm a military historian, and this is Hostile History, a podcast where we go inside some of the most defining conflicts and rebellions. In this episode, I'm joined by historian Niall Christie as we travel back to the Holy Land between the 11th and 13th centuries to try and help me understand what exactly happened during this time and how did it help shape our world today. This is Coin, Conflict, and Crusading. Today's story is layered with thousands of years of conflict, memory, and meaning. And this is because of its location, the Holy Land, a place where continents meet and faiths converge. It's a narrow strip of earth where prophets walked, where wars raged, and where empires rose and fell. The Holy Land is sacred to billions, For Jews, it is the site of the ancient temples and the spiritual heart of their history. For Muslims, it is home to one of Islam's holiest sites. And for Christians, it is the setting of some of the most profound moments in the life of Jesus. Its deep significance to multiple faiths has made it a focal point of political tension for centuries. The same streets that echo with prayer also carry the weight of disagreement, identity, and struggle. Today, it includes modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and the region has seen so much conflict, it is hard to tell when one ends and the next one begins.
Well, the crusading period has a lot to teach us in the modern day. You look around the world today and we see conflict and we see turmoil. And it seems that those people with the loudest voices are the ones who are trying to divide us as human beings on various grounds. Some of these people are drawing selectively on the memory of the Crusades, seeking to present it as a period of uncompromising conflict between Islam and Christianity, or Islam and Judeo-Christianity, perhaps we should say, as part of a so-called clash of civilizations, usually to further their own agenda.
That's Niall Christie. He is a medieval historian who wrote a book titled Muslims and Crusaders, Christianity's Wars in the Middle East, 1095 to 1382, which is now in its second edition. So what were the Crusades? You see, Hollywood would have you believe they were romanticized noble quests for heroic knights, often framed within the broader clash of civilizations. Video games take that imagery even further. Assassin's Creed, for instance, drops players directly into the era, blending historical settings with fictional conspiracies as players become part of a larger secret war, transforming history into an immersive playground. This is where Crusades are a shorthand for large-scale religious warfare, emphasizing spectacle over nuance. Even in modern language, the word crusade has drifted from its origins. Think of phrases like a crusade against corruption or a crusade for justice. Very often the term is stripped of its specific historical and religious meaning and repurposed to describe any passionate, mission-driven effort. But what crusades are we talking about here? We are talking about the popularly understood series of wars fought between the 11th and the 13th century and mainly between Christian and Muslim powers. The Crusades began when Christian leaders in Europe called for armies to travel to and take control of Jerusalem, a city considered holy by Christians, Muslims, and Jews, which was then under Muslim rule. Medieval historian Niall Christie said the first major effort, the First Crusade, succeeded in capturing the city in 1099.
The traditional view of the crusading period really starts off in 1095 when Pope Urban II preaches a series of sermons in which he encourages Western knights to march out to the Middle East in order to fight against the Muslims and to conquer Jerusalem. Urban was responding to calls for help that the popes had been receiving from the Byzantine emperor because they had lost territory to Muslim rulers. The response that the Byzantine emperor had probably been expecting was some fairly disciplined armies of knights who were going to march out to the east and support the Byzantine forces. What they actually got instead was waves of enthusiastic crusaders, mostly knights and men-at-arms, but also a number of others, who marched out to the east, took a whole bunch of territory on the eastern Mediterranean coast. By 1109, they have established 4 major states: the County of Edessa, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself was conquered by the Crusaders in July of 1099 in what most of the sources describe as a fairly bloody slaughter. That conquest had been facilitated by the fact that the Muslim rulers of the Middle East were themselves politically fragmented and divided. There were also religious differences. The rulers of Egypt were Shiites, and the rulers of most of the Eastern Mediterranean region were Sunnis. That of course, provided an additional reason for them to fight with each other. So we have Crusader states in the East, which are then ruled by Crusaders, or people of crusading ancestry, perhaps we can say, for the next 200 years. And in the meantime, they're fighting for control over those states with the Muslim rulers, as a consequence of which there is ongoing conflict. By the time that about 200 years has passed, though, the Muslims have gained the upper hand, and eventually in 1291, they conquer Acre, a modern Akko in Israel, and in the process, they bring under their control the last of the Crusader strongholds, and that's basically the end of Crusader presence on the eastern Mediterranean coast. Now, in more recent years, scholars have been taking a broader view of what the Crusades really consists of, expanding both the temporal and the geographical range that they're dealing with. So, for example, scholars will look at the conflicts that took place between Christians and Muslims in Iberia that really started as early as, well, the Christians start trying to take territory from the Muslims in Iberia as early as the 9th century. And that conflict is then ongoing all the way through to the 15th century.
As Niall said, although many people think the Crusades only happened in the Middle East, similar conflicts took place elsewhere. In Spain, the long process known as the Reconquista saw Christian kingdoms gradually take territory from Muslim rulers. These campaigns were treated as part of the same religious struggle as the Crusades. In Eastern Europe, there were also crusades against non-Christian groups. During the Northern Crusades, for instance, armies from places like Germany and Scandinavia fought to conquer and convert pagan peoples in the Baltic region. In the Middle East, Christian forces, often referred to as the Franks, led the conquest to capture the Holy Land in the name of Christendom.
I'd also like to take a moment to define the word Franks, because it's a term that gets used a lot when you talk about the Crusades. From the Muslim point of view, a Frank is someone who is European, or alternatively is of European descent. So in other words, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Crusaders who came out and took control of territory were Franks, and then their descendants who lived in that region and continued to rule in that region were also considered to be Franks, so people of European ancestry, essentially.
Hear that? That's now Crispy and McCrispy strips meeting creamy Caesar sauce. Sounds extra crispy. Caesar sauce at McDonald's, for a limited time. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
This episode is brought to you by Perfect Bistro Cat Food. Cats, this ad is for you. Has your human ever called you picky, persnickety, choosy? If so, Perfect Bistro Cat Food is for you. With ingredients like wild-caught tuna and pasture-raised lamb, tantalizing textures, and delectable flavors that meet even the most discerning cat standards. You're not picky, you're just perfectionists. Perfect Bistro, mealtime perfection for every cat. Have your human visit perfectbistro.com.
The Crusades left a lasting impact on relations between different cultures and religions across Europe and beyond. And most of us think of the Crusades as this non-stop, violent, constant warfare and bloodshed, as if the two sides could only ever meet each other on the battlefield. But Niall said that might not be the case.
Well, it's easy to get bound up in the idea of the Crusades being a 200-year period of, total war, as it were. But the truth is that for much of that period, the Crusaders and their descendants, the Franks, let's use that term, the Franks and the Muslims were interacting in other ways. They're making treaties with each other. They're trading with each other. Trade was huge. They are sharing ideas. They are attending each other's religious festivals. And in some cases, they were just hanging out. A lot of the intellectual and cultural advances that we see taking place in Europe were triggered by interactions with the Muslims during this period. This is the period when Europe gets paper making from the Muslims. The Muslims had got it centuries earlier from the Chinese. That technique was actually brought back to Europe by returning Crusaders. We know that. This is the period where in Europe you have the so-called 12th century Renaissance in intellectual life, because the intellectual tradition of Europe was being invigorated by texts from the classical tradition that had passed through to Europe through the medium of Arabic translations. And you have both texts from the classical tradition and other intellectual traditions, and also works that had been produced synthesizing those texts by Muslim and Jewish writers. This, after all, is the period of such figures as Ibn Sina, who we call Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, who we call Averroes. That transfer of texts is something that really occurs primarily through Iberia and through Sicily. The Crusader states tend to be where a lot of the more practical advances get passed on. And at the same time, I made the comment that these people are just hanging out with each other. There was one Muslim writer, Usam ibn Munkidh, a Syrian emir, who talks about his interactions with the Crusaders. He says that there was a Frankish knight whom he was so close to that the knight called him my brother. He talks about being friends with members of the Order of the Knights Templar, the staunchest defenders of the Frankish Holy Land. So these are not the kinds of interactions that you see occurring during what you might call a period of total war. This testifies to a much more nuanced and more complicated interaction between the Muslims and the Franks at the time.
Thinking of the Crusades as a constant, uninterrupted clash between Muslims and Christians is an oversimplification. While periods of intense violence certainly define the era, there were also long stretches of coexistence, negotiation, and everyday interaction between these communities, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. Coexistence was more practical than any other option. Niall said trade, in particular, encouraged cooperation. Markets brought together Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and commercial networks often crossed political and religious boundaries.
There is a lot more trading activity going on than fighting activity at the time. And it's always important to note that even before the onset of the classic crusading period, we have trade going on across the Eastern Mediterranean between Europe and the Muslim world. At the forefront of this trade were a number of citadels from Italy. Venice, Pisa, Genoa are the big trading powers of the time in particular. And when the Crusades got underway, these Italian cities provided navies and transport to support the crusading effort. In return for that, they were often granted tax exemptions and trading privileges in Crusader cities. So they had an interest in supporting crusading because it gave them increased access to markets and opportunities to make a profit. Sometimes we actually see trading ambitions becoming the driving forces behind crusading activity. The most infamous example is the so-called Fourth Crusade, the start of the 13th century. That was a crusade that gathered in Venice and then was intending to head for the Eastern Mediterranean to go and fight against the Muslims. But as a result of issues with paying the Venetians what had been promised, the Venetians were able to redirect that trade, first of all, to seize control of Zara in Dalmatia, which was a port that they had traditionally had control over. And then they got mixed up in the literally Byzantine politics of the Byzantine Empire and wound up eventually diverting to Constantinople, which they sacked in 1204. That Constantinople came under a Western, so Catholic Christian ruler, and in the process, the Venetians had managed to eliminate a major trading rival. I mean, I'm simplifying that particular story, of course. So we do see trade and crusading activity being interlinked in that way. But Muslim rulers also saw the value of trade because it brought goods and money into Muslim territory, including things that they weren't able to get locally. Particularly important in this regard were wood and iron and naval supplies, which the Muslims were buying from European merchants, then using them to build war machines and equip navies to go out and fight against the Crusaders. Mm-hmm. The popes recognized that this was not an ideal situation, selling war materials to your enemy so that they can come and fight you with them. And they actually tried to ban trade from time to time, either just banning trade completely or banning the trade in particular materials. But those bans never really stuck because there was frankly too much money to be made. Meanwhile, you have rulers like Saladin, who, despite his enthusiasm for fighting against the Franks, recognized the lucrative possibilities that trade could offer. And when he wasn't fighting against the Franks, he was promoting trade with them.
Right.
We actually see major conflicts between the Crusaders and the Muslims, generally only causing temporary hiatuses in trade. Even when Saladin took Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187, trade resumed between the Levant and Europe the following year. So it was really a very temporary hiatus.
That's because ongoing war would be difficult to maintain for Crusader states that were relatively small and militarily vulnerable. So maintaining a functioning society required compromise. And central to that compromise was trade.
If you're a Western merchant who is going to the Muslim world, you are going to arrive there and you're going to pay your customs duties on the goods that you're bringing in. Then when you are actually in one of the Muslim cities where you're trading, you're going to be staying in a building. And there were certain buildings that were set aside for merchants. And these buildings are known as funduks, which is actually an Arabic word that derives from a Greek word, pandocheion. And in the modern day, you use the word funduk to mean a hotel. At the time, we're talking about a trade hostelry, so it's kind of like a hotel, but there's also space for storing goods and these kinds of things. Those funduks are controlled by the Muslim authorities. It allows them to keep an eye on who's in their city. It sometimes allows them to control their movements. There were, in some cases, funduks that were actually locked at night to prevent the foreign merchants from sneaking out at night and going and potentially causing trouble. And sometimes even also locked during the Friday noon prayers, again, to stop merchants from wandering around unsupervised. So you're going to be staying in a state-controlled building. So your movements are definitely monitored. And then from there, you're going to be meeting with either Muslim merchants who you're selling your goods to. Sometimes they were actually selling goods outside the funduks. They were actually basically setting up stalls and selling goods to the local population. Though the kind of volume of goods that these merchants are bringing in most of the time, that's not really practical. They're usually selling loads of goods to Muslim merchants who are then going to sell them or trade them on elsewhere.
One of the major arteries for commerce was Alexandria in Egypt. It was one of the great cities of the medieval Mediterranean, which meant it had a significant strategic importance. For the Crusaders, Alexandria was both a temptation and a target because it could shift the balance of power in the Holy Land.
Alexandria was the main channel for goods that were passing from the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And even before the Crusades, goods had been passing through that channel as a result of the expansion, if you like, of European presence in the Levant and the interaction, the contact that's going on between Europe and the Levant at this point in time. We see an expansion of that trade, and Alexandria really becomes the kind of humming hub, if you like, of trading activity. There were other important trading cities, for example, Acre in Crusader territory in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but none of them managed to achieve the same volume of goods and I guess the same prestige that Alexandria had as essentially the trading center of the Eastern Mediterranean.
In essence, Alexandria was a prize that symbolized power beyond the battlefield. It was a reminder that the conflict was not only about sacred spaces, but also about controlling the arteries of commerce and influence in the medieval world. And all of this reflects a broader pattern of the Crusading era. Economic cooperation could coexist with religious and military rivalry.
Well, most of the time, of course, people signed treaties to stop fighting. And usually what would happen would be that one participant or another in a conflict would understand that they needed to make peace for whatever reason. It might well be because they recognized that they were outmatched. It might be because they just wanted time to sort of settle back and rearm before their next military campaign. It might simply be a recognition that neither participant in the conflict could get the upper hand. A classic example is the peace treaty that was made in 1092 between Richard the Lionheart of England and the Muslim ruler Saladin. They had just spent 3 years fighting over who was going to get control of Jerusalem. Saladin was holding Jerusalem at the time. Richard wanted to conquer it. He was unable to do so, but Saladin didn't have enough forces in the field to enable him to simply drive Richard off the coast. And so eventually these two men realized that this wasn't going to work. So they made a peace treaty. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but the Franks were allowed to keep some territory on the coast and to visit Jerusalem on pilgrimages. So a lot of the time it was simply a recognition that fighting needed to stop. But of course, treaties also open up space for other negotiations. Prisoner exchanges, arrangements of divisions of territory, like the example with Richard and Saladin that I just mentioned. Trade agreements were often made as well during these kind of treaty periods.
Hi, I'm Jane Coaston, former writer and podcaster for places like the New York Times, The Atlantic, and National Review. And now I'm here to hang out with you 5 days a week on What a Day, Crooked's daily news podcast. That's right. Now who's respected on both sides? Okay, yeah, it's not me. It's probably still just Dolly Parton. Moving on. These days, it's hard to separate what matters from all the noise, especially when the noise somehow also feels like it's made out of knives. That's why every weekday, the team and I scour the headlines to bring you the stories that matter most to the way you live in just 20 minutes. Listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts.
I wrote a little song to remind you, Choice Hotels get you more of the experiences you value. The Cambria Hotel's got it all. A rooftop bar, have a ball. Cocktails up here feel just right. Is Cambria amazing? All right. Bring a date, your team, or even your mom. Book direct at choicehotels.com. See you on the roof.
The GLP-1 pill you've been waiting for is now on Ro. Yep, it's finally here. With the same clinically proven ingredient, now in a pill, and now on Ro. It's the first FDA-approved GLP-1 pill for weight loss. At the lowest price available, that's one daily GLP-1 pill for big results. Now on Ro. Go to ro.co/listen to see if you qualify. RX only. Go to ro.co/safety for serious side effects and boxed warning associated with GLP-1s.
During Saladin's time, truces and negotiations with Crusader rulers were common. After he recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, he allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the city, avoiding the kind of mass violence that had occurred previously. His opponent was Richard the Lionheart, or Richard I of England. He was a Crusader king, famed warrior, and leader in the Third Crusade, which took place from 1189 to 1192 with the explicit goal of recapturing the Holy Land after it was conquered by Saladin. Now, Saladin was a Kurdish Muslim ruler who united Islamic forces and became renowned for his military skill, his leadership, and his chivalry. One of the fascinating things about Richard and Saladin was their shared respect for one another. They never met in person, but Saladin's brother actually hung out with Richard, and they got along famously, almost too famously for those in Richard's inner circle. So we have this strange situation where Richard and Saladin were fighting each other, but certainly showing each other immense respect. But if the two sides could have been friendly, how friendly did they get? Did alliances ever really form? Niall's answer might just surprise you.
The popular perception tends to be this kind of binary, it's Christians versus Muslims. It's always important to remember, of course, that we have multiple Crusader states with multiple rulers who have their own agendas. And we have multiple Muslim states with multiple rulers who also have their own agendas. And very early on, we see alliances being formed between Muslim rulers and Frankish rulers. Even before the first waves of Crusaders took control of Jerusalem in what we call the First Crusade, the rulers of Egypt were already negotiating with them to try and make an alliance against the Muslim rulers of Syria. That agreement very quickly broke down when, contrary to the expectations of the Egyptian rulers, the Crusaders took Jerusalem from them. But it was very much a sign of things to come. The Crusaders were very quickly drawn into the realpolitik of the region, the web of political alliances and political maneuverings that were going on. And religion became a secondary concern that was only really used as a way to unite people or justify activities if a ruler saw it as being appropriate to do so. We even have records of battles where you have Muslim forces and Frankish forces fighting on one side against Muslim forces and Frankish forces on the other side. Politics really came to trump religion very quickly.
As Niall said, alliances sometimes crossed religious lines when it suited political needs. Muslim rulers occasionally allied with Crusader states against rival Muslim factions and vice versa. Loyalty was often shaped as much by local politics as by religion. However, this coexistence was always fragile in lands that were constantly being conquered, reconquered, and reconquered over and over again. One year, a region might have a Muslim ruler, the next year a Christian. So this begs the question, what was life like for the people being ruled?
The vast majority of the population of the region that the Crusaders took over were peasant farmers.
Yeah.
We get very excited when we're studying history about all these chronologies and biographies and poetry and all these other texts that are written and that we use as sources for our study. But at the same time, that they're being written by a very educated elite who comprise usually between about 5 and 10% of the entire population.
Right.
The vast majority beyond that are peasants of some sort or another, the vast majority of whom are living by raising crops. This, of course, is a phenomenon that's true throughout most of the world in the pre-modern period. And for the most part, when the Franks took over territories that had previously been ruled by Muslim rulers, for your average peasant working in the fields, not much changed. Really, what changed, I suppose, was that they were paying taxes to somebody different. And somebody who, I guess, was originally a foreigner or of foreign descent, but at the same time was just like any of their other overlords, really, in many ways. And the Franks, it's always important to remember the Franks were minority rulers. They constituted a very tiny portion of the population there. They're constantly sending calls to Europe asking for more people to come out and help them run the Crusader states because there are so few of them, and to fight for the Crusader states, of course. As minority rulers, they recognized that there wasn't much that they could change in the territories that they took control of. And so in most cases, they didn't, because after all, it wouldn't have been practical. They couldn't really try and impose a new way of life on the populations that they were ruling over because there were just too many people to try and control.
So what we are understanding is that in many areas, Muslims continued to live in their own villages under their own local leaders, paying taxes to their new rulers despite theological differences. And if we really think about it, a peasant farmer in the Holy Land probably had a lot more in common with a Christian peasant farmer in Europe than either ever fully understood. Niall said these territories may have been ruled by Franks, but the majority of the population remained Muslim. And rather than expelling everyone, Crusader rulers often allowed local populations to remain.
It was a case of passive acceptance. There were some cases where Muslims did decide that when the Franks took over, they were going to leave. We have some records of peasant populations who decided that they would rather move to Muslim territory and not be controlled by Frankish rulers. But that we do not see a mass migration of the Muslim populations out of the territories that the Franks take over. And I mean, part of that is, of course, because if you're a medieval peasant, you're very much reliant on the land that you're living on to feed you and enable you to pay your taxes. And walking away from your source of income is something that's incredibly hard to do. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do with yourself? But also, given how little their situation changed for a lot of them, there wasn't really a motivation to move. for the most part. And there were undoubtedly some Frankish rulers who treated their Muslim peasant populations, along with, let's not forget, the Christians and Jews who were also living under Crusader rule, pretty harshly. But in other cases, we have records of them actually treating them better than their Muslim overlords did. The classic example comes from a travelogue of a Spanish Muslim traveler called Muhammad ibn Jubayr, and we'll get to him. But he traveled through the Holy Land on the way to perform the Hajj, the greater pilgrimage to Mecca. And while he was there, he observed in his work that the Muslim populations living under the Franks enjoy a better situation than they do under the Muslim overlords because the taxes they're paying are actually lower. Ibn Jubayr is pretty critical, though. He's critical of the peasants who do not up and migrate to Muslim territory and prefer to stay under the rule of infidels. He's also pretty critical, though, of the Muslim rulers who charged their peasants so much in the way of taxes that they would rather live under the Franks. Of course, Ibn Jubayr was critical of pretty much everybody. This is a man who had decided he needed to perform the Hajj, the greater pilgrimage, to expiate his guilt, because back in Iberia, his patron had forced him to drink seven cups of wine, and he decided that this was enough to require him to go to Mecca. Right. So he comes across as being pretty judgmental of just about everybody he meets as to whether or not they're being good Muslims and following Islamic teaching as he travels. This is a classic feature of travelogue literature from any tradition, though, is usually it's the tourists who are most judgmental of the people that they meet on their travels.
If you're a longtime listener, you won't be surprised to know that history is far more complex than many people like to think. The medieval Crusades didn't take place in a world that had just two sides always at war. It was a complex human environment where goods, ideas, money, and people were constantly exchanged and moved back and forth. It was messy, it was complicated, and for long stretches of time, it was even peaceful.
Well, the crusading period has a lot to teach us in the modern day. You look around the world today and we see conflict and we see turmoil. And it seems that those people with the loudest voices are the ones who are trying to divide us as human beings on various grounds. Some of these people are drawing selectively on the memory of the Crusades, seeking to present it as a period of uncompromising conflict between Islam and Christianity, or Islam and Judeo-Christianity, perhaps we should say, as part of a so-called clash of civilizations, usually to further their own agendas. And here I'm thinking of people like, white supremacists who are drawing on the memory of the Templars, likewise Islamophobes who are doing the same kind of thing. Also, of course, Islamist terrorists who are looking at the Crusades and presenting them as a period of Western warfare against the Muslim world with the aim of exterminating Islam, not to mention political leaders of in all sorts of different places, both in the Muslim world and outside of it. To present the crusading period in that way is as we've seen, gross misrepresentation. We must acknowledge there was a lot of conflict and bloodshed. There were a lot of battles. A lot of people died, got injured. We can't ignore the fact that there's some really ugly aspects to the crusading period. But at the same time, that's only part of the story.
Right.
For much of this period, the Muslims and the Franks were living, for the most part, in peace with one another, despite the differences between them that occasionally flared up into armed conflict. And certain limits on their cultural understandings. And what we see, when we see a flare-up of violence, it's usually because a fresh wave of crusaders have arrived from Europe, or because you have a Muslim leader who is using counter-crusading propaganda as a way to legitimize their rule, which they may or may not be using cynically, depending on how cynical you want to be about the medieval Muslim leaders. But we've talked about not only military alliances, but also trade in goods and in knowledge. We've talked about the social and religious activities that these people are sharing. In a world where there was immense pressure on both the religious and the political level to see each other only as enemies, the Muslims and the Franks were able not only to coexist, but actually to flourish together in the Eastern Mediterranean for about 200 years, and in Iberia for much longer. Now, we live in a world where we have much better communications. We have much better access to knowledge, a much better ability to understand each other. So if the Muslims and the Franks can do it, then that does really beg the question, why can't we?
As Niall said, it seems that some people want to use the historical memory of the Crusades to justify why we are at war and why we should go to war. If they can convince us that war and violence is just the norm, and it has always been that way, then they can justify just about anything. But if we truly look at the Crusades as an example, we know that their attempts are inaccurate. They're false. Sure, there was war, but there was plenty of peace. The historical memory of that era is one that was much more peaceful than they would have you believe. And that can give us hope as we perhaps allow ourselves to move towards mutual respect and coexistence, which will hopefully lead to a much-needed, more peaceful world. Thank you for joining me this week, and a special thanks to Niall Christie. For more info, check out his book titled Muslims and Crusaders, Christianity's Wars in the Middle East, 1095 to 1382. Join us soon for a brand new episode of Hostile History, where we will take you inside another conflict and uncover how it has left its indelible mark on the world we know today. Hostile History was written by me, Dr. David Boris, and is part of the Canyon Entertainment umbrella. The show is produced by Curious Cast. Our producer was Dila Velasquez. Our audio producer and sound designer was Rob Johnson. Our executive producer is Chris Dunner-Duncombe, the director of Curious Cast, podcast for curious minds. Keep your powder dry.